Are we not now perfectly familiar with thinking machines? Why should we not think of the brain as a computer, perhaps, and of what we call mind as nothing more than the unfolding of the mechanical algorithms embedded in the software that the brain processes? This is the view largely endorsed by the strong artificial intelligence factions among cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind. Rather than consciousness, understood in the common sense as the intentional act of an indivisible subject, the mind contains only flows of data and behavior, in and out, functional relations, discriminatory filters, information states, all erected upon a simple digital platform, binary or some other kind, operating by way of a few simple physiological switches that can be turned on and off. For some theorists, this implies that an artificial computer comparable in complexity to the human brain and nervous system could achieve something like our conscious states. To others, like Daniel Dennett, it is more correct to say that neither we nor our computers possess conscious states, as commonly conceived. We and they merely have functions that, seen from a certain naive vantage, look like consciousness. Unfortunately, the entire theory is an incorrigible confusion of categories, for a very great number of reasons. Foremost among them, the absolute dependency of all computational processes upon the prior reality of intentional consciousness. I do not mean this simply in the sense that computers and their programs happen to be designed by human minds, which is an important but ancillary issue. After all, one could argue that the brain, too, has been designed and programmed, perhaps by an intelligent designer, or perhaps purely by natural selection, though in the latter case, the intentional content of the programming would be a miracle. I mean rather that, as John Searle has correctly argued, apart from specific representations produced by intentional consciousness, the operations of a computer are merely physical events devoid of meaning. The physical brain may be something very remotely like the physical object we use to run software programs, but to speak of the mind in terms of computation is really no better than speaking of representation in terms of photography. The analogy is momentarily compelling, in a purely pictorial way at least, but it cannot help us make sense of what consciousness is, because it involves comparing the mind to a device that exists only relative to the logically prior and mysteriously irreducible reality of mind itself. This would perhaps be more immediately obvious to us if we were not the victims of our own metaphors. We have become so accustomed to speaking of computers as artificial minds, and of their operations as thinking, that we have forgotten that these are mere figures of speech. We speak of computer memory, for instance, but of course computers recall nothing. They do not even store any remembered information, in the sense of symbols with real semantic content, real meaning, but only preserve the binary patterns of certain electronic notations. And I do not mean simply that the computers are not aware of the information that they contain. I mean that, in themselves, they do not contain any semantic information at all. They are merely the silicon parchment and electrical ink on which we record symbols that possess semantic content only in respect to our intentional representations of their meanings. A computer no more remembers the files stored in it than the device on which you are listening to this audio remembers my argument to this point. No one can credibly argue that even though computer memory may have no intentional meaning, still, the higher functions of the computer's software transform those notations into coherent meanings by integrating them into a larger functional system. There are no higher functions and no programs as such, either in the computer considered purely as a physical object, or in its operations considered purely as physical events. There are only the material components of the machine, electrical impulses and binary patterns, which we use to construct certain representations, and which have meanings only so long as they are the objects of the representing mind's attention. Call it a vicious circle, the circuit of irony, the dialectic of projection, or what you will. We have imposed the metaphor of an artificial mind on computers and then re-imported the image of a thinking machine and imposed it upon our minds. If you address a letter to yourself and post it, it will almost certainly come back to you, but you would be foolish eagerly to tear the envelope open in the hope of finding something unexpected inside. Computational models of the mind would make sense if what a computer actually does could be characterized as an elementary version of what the mind does, or at least as something remotely like thinking. In fact, though, there is not even a useful analogy to be drawn here. A computer does not even really compute. We compute using it as a tool. We can set a program in motion to calculate the square root of pi, but the stream of digits that will appear on the screen will have mathematical content only because of our intentions, and because we, not the computer, are running algorithms. The computer, in itself, as an object or a series of physical events, does not contain or produce any symbols at all. Its operations are not determined by any semantic content, but only by binary sequences that mean nothing in themselves. The visible figures that appear on the computer screen are only the electronic traces of sets of binary correlates, and they serve as symbols only when we represent them as such and assign them intelligible significances. The computer could just as well be programmed so that it would respond to the request for the square root of pi with the result Rupert Bear. Nor would it be wrong to do so, because an ensemble of merely material components and purely physical events can neither be wrong nor right about anything. In fact, it cannot be about anything at all. Software no more thinks than a minute hand knows the time, or the printed word pelican knows what a pelican is. We might just as well liken the mind to an abacus, a typewriter, or a library. No computer has ever used language, or responded to a question, or assigned a meaning to anything. No computer has ever added as much as two numbers together, let alone entertained a thought, and none ever will. The only intelligence or consciousness or even illusion of consciousness in the whole computational process is situated, quite incommutably, in us. Everything seemingly analogous to our minds in our machines is reducible, when analyzed correctly, only back to our own minds once again, and we end where we began, immersed in the same mystery as ever. We believe otherwise only when, like Narcissus bent above the waters, we look down at our creations and, captivated by what we see reflected in them, imagine that another gaze has met our own. As for those, then, who are committed to the practical project of producing genuine artificial intelligence built upon computational models of thought, theirs is a poignantly hopeless enterprise. When, in 1997, Garry Kasparov at last lost a chess match to the computer Deep Blue, frissons of excitement coursed through the artificial intelligence community and the press. It was blazoned abroad that the computer had defeated the chess master and had done so by thinking with greater agility than its human opponent. But it had done neither of these things, as became clear in 2003 when Kasparov faced the far more formidable Deep Jr. and played to a draw. This mystified many true believers in artificial intelligence. The computer's program could process 3 million possible strategies every second, whereas Kasparov was able to consider only a few at any given juncture. But, as Kasparov remarked, whichever options he considered were the best conceivable. This is because what Kasparov was doing was precisely what the computer, in running through millions upon millions of unconscious computational configurations, was not doing, even for an instant: thinking. Not a single thought passed through its pretty little circuit board, nor did it have intentions, or anything remotely like intentions, nor did it play chess. all of its putatively mental actions were actually derivative consequences of the conscious intentions of its programmers, who used its circuitry to run algorithms that were largely the distillation of a vast archive of past chess matches, some of them Kasparov's own. The computer was merely the alembic through which the distillate flowed. When Kasparov lost his game in 1997, he was not defeated by a machine, but by a large alliance of human opponents, himself among them. And nowhere in that process was there some intelligent entity called Deep Blue. Conversely, when Kasparov thought about and made his moves upon the board, he may have employed certain functions in his brain analogous to the functions of a computer, but his conscious act of thinking was not in itself a kind of computation. His mind was not merely mechanically repeating every imaginable configuration of the chessboard and then automatically selecting those moves statistically most likely to meet with success. Rather, he understood what he was doing, subjectively and intentionally, and his ability to understand, to grasp at once the principles of chess strategy, his memory of his previous experiences, his volitional purposes, and a host of other things, allowed him to accomplish ends that a mindless device like a computer never could. Just as no computer program will ever likely be devised that could, say, adequately translate a poem from one language to another, no program will ever play chess, even if its synthesis of the skills of its inventors should prove invincible by a human master of the game. Rational thought, understanding, intention, will, consciousness, is not a species of computation. To imagine that it is involves an error regarding not only what the mind does, but what a computer does as well. One of the assumptions underlying artificial intelligence theory is that the brain, like a computer, uses algorithms in the form of complex neuronal events, which translate neural information into representational symbols. If we were to undertake a homuncular decomposition of the mind in computationalist terms, supposedly, we would descend through a symbolic level of operations down to a level of something like binary functions, then down further until we reach the simple switches in the brain that underlie those functions. But this reverses the order of causality on both sides of the analogy. Neither brains nor computers, considered purely as physical systems, contain algorithms or symbols. It is only as represented to consciousness that the physical behaviors of those systems yield any intentional content. It is in the consciousness of the person who programs or uses a computer, and in the consciousness that operates through the physical apparatus of the brain, that symbols reside. In fact, it is only for this reason that symbolic translation is possible, because the metabolism of data into meaning, or of one kind of meaning into another, is the work of an intentional subjectivity that already transcends the difference between the original text and its translation. A computer programmer can translate meanings or functions into algorithms because, being intentionally conscious, he or she is capable of representing the operations of the computer not merely as physical events, but as intelligible symbolic transcriptions of something else. It is in his or her consciousness at either end of the process that the physical serves the purposes of the mental. If the brain produces symbols of the world perceived by the senses, for instance, it is not a physical transaction, but a mental act of representation that already intends perception as an experience of the world beyond. And it is solely there, where symbolic meaning exists, that anything we might call thinking occurs. Thus, even if we could imaginatively or deductively descend from the level of consciousness down through strata of symbols, simple notational functions, and neural machinery, we would not be able then to ascend back again the way we came. Once more, The physicalist reduction of any phenomenon to purely material forces explains nothing if one cannot then reconstruct that phenomenon from its material basis without invoking any higher causes. But this, no computational picture of thought can ever do. Symbols exist only from above, as it were, in the consciousness looking downward along the path of that descent, acting always as a higher cause upon material reality. Looking up in the opposite direction, from below to above, one finds only an untraversable abyss, separating the intentional nullity of matter from the intentional plenitude of mind. It is an absolute error to imagine that the electrical activity in a computer is itself computation, and when a believer in artificial intelligence claims that the electrochemical operations of a brain are a kind of computation, and that consciousness arises from that computation, he or she is saying something utterly without meaning. All computation is ontologically dependent on consciousness, simply said, and so computation cannot provide the foundation upon which consciousness rests. One might just as well attempt to explain the existence of the sun as the result of the warmth and brightness of summer days.